The convoy stopped moving at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a stretch of French road that should have been empty of everything except retreating Germans. General George S. Patton stood beside his jeep, hands on his hips, staring at the horizon with the kind of fury that made colonels nervous. His Third Army had been racing across France like a blade through paper, town after town falling before his tanks had even cooled their engines. Now, without warning, without enemy contact, without any tactical reason that made sense to anyone wearing American insignia, the fuel trucks had simply stopped arriving. Patton knew what this meant. Someone had decided his war was moving too fast. Someone had decided that glory, the kind that comes from liberating capitals and accepting surrenders, needed to be shared. And that someone wore stars on their shoulders and took orders from men who cared more about politics than about ending the bloodshed. This was September of 1944. And the Third Army had just been strangled by its own supply line. What Patton did not say out loud, not to his staff and certainly not to the war correspondents who followed his movements like pilgrims tracking a prophet, was that he understood exactly whose hand had tightened around his throat. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of British and Canadian forces in northwestern Europe, had been pushing his own plan for weeks. Montgomery wanted a single concentrated thrust into Germany, a narrow spear aimed directly at Berlin, and he wanted his 21st Army Group to carry that spear. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had listened. Eisenhower, who spent his days managing egos and his nights worrying about political fractures that could split the alliance apart, had made a choice. The fuel that should have powered Patton's sprint toward the Rhine was being diverted north to support Montgomery's audacious gamble, an operation that would soon be known as Market Garden. Patton received the news through official channels, through carefully worded orders that spoke of strategic priorities and logistical realities. But he read between the lines. This was not strategy. This was sabotage. Montgomery had never made any secret of his disdain for the Americans, or more specifically, for their approach to warfare. The British general believed in meticulous preparation, overwhelming firepower at the point of attack, and a methodical advance that left nothing to chance. He had defeated Rommel in the deserts of North Africa by refusing to move until every supply dump was stocked and every unit briefed to the point of exhaustion. He viewed improvisation as the refuge of commanders who had failed to plan properly. When he looked at Patton's racing columns, at the American general's willingness to outrun his own supply lines and trust in momentum to solve problems that caution would only multiply, Montgomery saw recklessness. He saw a cowboy playing at war. What Montgomery either could not or would not see was that Patton's speed had already saved thousands of Allied lives by preventing the Germans from establishing defensive positions. The Third Army had liberated more French territory in 3 weeks than some Allied units had managed in 3 months. But liberation, in Montgomery's calculation, was not the same as victory. Victory required Berlin, and Berlin, Montgomery believed, required Montgomery. The personal animosity between the two men had roots that went deeper than tactical disagreement. Patton had landed in Sicily in the summer of 1943 as part of an Anglo-American invasion force, and from the beginning, the campaign had turned into an unspoken race. Montgomery commanded the British 8th Army on the eastern side of the island, while Patton led the American 7th Army in the west. The objective was Messina, the port city at the northeastern tip, and both commanders understood that whoever arrived first would claim not just a geographic prize but a symbolic one. Montgomery's advance stalled in the face of determined German resistance in the mountainous interior. Patton, sensing an opportunity that had nothing to do with the official plan, swung his forces north along the coast in a lightning move that bypassed enemy strongpoints and reached Messina hours before the British. Montgomery arrived to find American troops already occupying the city, and the humiliation cut deep. Patton had proven that speed and audacity could achieve what methodical preparation could not, and he had done it on a stage where the entire Allied command was watching. Montgomery never forgot. He never forgave. By the autumn of 1944, the strategic situation in Europe had evolved into something unprecedented in modern warfare. The Germans were retreating on all fronts, their armies shattered by the twin catastrophes of Normandy and the Soviet summer offensive in the east. The question facing the Allies was no longer whether Germany would fall but how quickly and at what cost. Patton believed the answer was obvious. The German army was broken, disorganized, and desperately short of everything except fear. A fast-moving armored thrust could punch through the collapsing front, cross the Rhine before the enemy had time to regroup, and drive all the way to Berlin before winter set in. End the war in 1944. Save hundreds of thousands of lives. Deny the Soviets the chance to occupy half of Europe. The path was open, the prize was visible, and all it required was fuel, ammunition, and the will to keep moving. But Eisenhower, watching the same battlefields through a different lens, saw risks that Patton dismissed. A narrow thrust would create a dangerous salient, a finger poke deep into enemy territory with exposed flanks and a lengthening supply line. If the Germans managed to organize a counterattack, they could cut that finger off. Eisenhower preferred a broad front strategy, advancing on multiple axes simultaneously, keeping the Germans under pressure everywhere and denying them the opportunity to concentrate their remaining forces against a single point of attack. It was cautious. It was methodical. And to Patton, it was madness. Montgomery proposed something that fell between the two extremes, though in his mind it was not a compromise. Operation Market Garden would drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines in the Netherlands, seizing a series of bridges that would create a corridor for British armored forces to race through. If successful, the operation would outflank the formidable Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and position Montgomery's armies for a dash into the North German plain, and ultimately Berlin. It was bold, dramatic, and exactly the kind of single concentrated thrust that Montgomery had been advocating for weeks. The difference, Patton noted with bitter clarity, was that this bold plan belonged to Montgomery. When Eisenhower approved Market Garden and allocated the supplies necessary to support it, he was making a choice that extended far beyond tactics. He was managing an alliance that depended on British cooperation, on keeping Churchill happy, on ensuring that the war's final chapter did not become an entirely American production. Politics and strategy had become inseparable, and Patton's Third Army paid the price in empty fuel tanks. The soldiers in Patton's divisions did not understand why they had stopped. They had been told their whole lives that Americans did not quit, that once you had the enemy on the run you kept punching until they fell down and stayed down. They had watched German units disintegrate in front of them, entire battalions surrendering without a fight because they knew the war was lost and saw no point in dying for a regime that had already failed. The road to Germany was open. The Rhine was visible on maps that company commanders studied by flashlight. And then, inexplicably, the orders came to halt in place, to conserve fuel, to wait for supplies that never seemed to arrive. Some of the men blamed the rear echelon types, the staff officers and logistics coordinators who always found reasons why the fighting men could not have what they needed. Others suspected something darker, whispered about British jealousy and political deals made in rooms far from the battlefield. Patton did nothing to discourage these suspicions. He fumed openly, cursed in language that would have scandalized civilian audiences, and made it clear to anyone who would listen that his army was being throttled by men who cared more about headlines than victory. Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944, with an armada of transport aircraft and gliders that darkened the skies over the Netherlands. The paratroopers dropped into their designated zones and seized the bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen with remarkable efficiency. For the first 2 days, the operation proceeded almost exactly as Montgomery had planned. British armored columns raced up the single narrow road toward Arnhem, the final bridge that would complete the corridor. But at Arnhem, something went catastrophically wrong. The British 1st Airborne Division landed directly on top of 2 SS Panzer divisions that intelligence had assured them were not there. Instead of facing depleted garrison troops, the paratroopers found themselves fighting elite veterans equipped with tanks and self-propelled guns. The bridge at Arnhem became a killing ground. The British armored column, stuck on a single road and hammered by German anti-tank guns firing from the flanks, could not reach the beleaguered paratroopers in time. After 9 days of savage fighting, the survivors of the 1st Airborne withdrew across the river, leaving behind thousands of dead and captured. Market Garden had failed. Montgomery's bold gamble had consumed men and supplies that could have supported a dozen different operations, and it had achieved nothing except to prove that the German army, even in retreat, remained a deadly opponent. Patton watched the disaster unfold with the grim satisfaction of a man whose warnings had been ignored. He had predicted that Montgomery's plan relied too heavily on optimism and not enough on the realities of what happens when a plan encounters an enemy who refuses to cooperate. But satisfaction did not win wars, and while Montgomery's divisions licked their wounds in the Netherlands, Patton's Third Army remained stuck in eastern France, still waiting for the fuel that had been promised and never delivered. The autumn rains began, turning roads into rivers of mud and making the kind of rapid armored advances that Patton favored almost impossible. The window was closing. The Germans, given time to regroup, began fortifying the Siegfried Line and preparing defensive positions along the Rhine. What had been a rout in August had become a grinding campaign of attrition by October. The easy victories were over. Patton knew it, and the knowledge filled him with a rage that never entirely left his eyes. Eisenhower, for his part, found himself in an impossible position. He commanded an alliance, not just an army, and the political pressures bearing down on him came from directions that had nothing to do with battlefield tactics. Churchill wanted British forces to play a leading role in the final defeat of Germany, partly for reasons of national pride and partly because the Prime Minister understood that whoever occupied German territory at war's end would shape the post-war settlement. Roosevelt, increasingly focused on the Pacific and on managing the Soviet relationship, cared less about who took Berlin than about ending the European war quickly and with minimal American casualties. Stalin, watching from Moscow, had his own plans for Germany and absolutely no intention of letting the Western Allies reach Berlin first if Soviet armies could prevent it. Against this backdrop of competing interests, Eisenhower tried to chart a course that would keep the alliance intact while still winning the war. He liked Patton personally, admired the man's fighting spirit, but he also recognized that Patton's political instincts were non-existent. Turning Patton loose to race Montgomery to Berlin would create exactly the kind of public spectacle that could fracture Allied unity at the moment it was needed most. The two generals met occasionally at headquarters briefings, and the encounters had a rehearsed quality, like actors performing a play they had staged many times before. Montgomery would present his plans with the absolute confidence of a man who had never seriously doubted his own judgment, speaking in clipped tones that suggested any disagreement could only stem from misunderstanding the obvious. Patton would listen with barely concealed impatience, his jaw tight, his hands sometimes gripping the edge of the table as if restraining himself from violence. When Patton spoke, his words came fast and aggressive, laced with metaphors drawn from cavalry charges and prize fights, from a vision of warfare that Montgomery found distastefully American. The other officers in the room would watch this performance with a mixture of fascination and dread, knowing that the tension between these two men reflected deeper fissures in the alliance itself. And Eisenhower, presiding over these meetings like a referee at a boxing match, would steer the conversation back to safer ground, to questions of logistics and objectives that could be discussed without triggering another explosion. What neither Patton nor Montgomery fully grasped at the time was that the race to Berlin had already been decided in rooms they would never enter. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had agreed on occupation zones that would divide Germany after its surrender. Berlin fell well within the zone allocated to the Soviet Union. The political leadership of the Western Allies had, in effect, conceded the German capital to Stalin in exchange for Soviet commitments on other matters. This decision remained closely held, shared only with the highest levels of command, and it meant that any race to Berlin was, from a strategic perspective, pointless. The Western armies could reach the city first, could plant their flags on the Reichstag, and it would change nothing. They would still have to withdraw to the agreed-upon occupation lines. Soviet troops would still occupy Berlin. The race that Patton and Montgomery imagined they were running had been called off before it began, and nobody had bothered to tell them. Patton's Third Army finally received the fuel and supplies it needed in early November, but by then the character of the campaign had changed. The swift pursuit across France had given way to brutal fighting in the fortified cities of Lorraine and Alsace. Metz, an ancient fortress city that the Germans had turned into a modern strongpoint, held out for weeks against repeated American assaults. The fighting was house to house, room to room, the kind of grinding attrition that consumed men and material without producing the dramatic breakthroughs that made headlines. Patton hated this kind of warfare, hated seeing his tanks reduced to mobile pillboxes supporting infantry assaults, but he had no choice. The Germans had used the time purchased by Market Garden's failure, and by Eisenhower's decision to halt Patton's advance to prepare defenses that would cost the Allies dearly. By the time the Third Army reached the German border in late November, winter had arrived in force. Snow covered the ground, temperatures dropped below freezing, and the soldiers who had been promised they would be home by Christmas began to realize they had been lied to. December brought the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. German forces smashed through thinly held American positions in Belgium, creating a bulge in the Allied line that threatened to become a catastrophe. Eisenhower ordered Patton to disengage from his offensive in the Saar, turn his entire army 90 degrees north, and drive into the southern flank of the German penetration. It was a maneuver of extraordinary complexity, requiring the movement of hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles in winter conditions over roads that barely qualified as roads. Patton executed it in 72 hours. His division slammed into the German flank at Bastogne, broke the encirclement of the trapped American paratroopers, and helped turn the Ardennes offensive from a potential disaster into a German defeat that consumed the last of Hitler's mobile reserves. It was Patton's finest moment as a commander, a demonstration of operational skill that even Montgomery had to acknowledge. But it was not the kind of victory that captured public imagination. There were no triumphant entries into liberated capitals, no newsreel footage of cheering crowds. Just frozen soldiers fighting in forests and snow, dying to undo mistakes that should never have been made. Montgomery, meanwhile, had been given command of American forces north of the Bulge during the crisis, a decision that infuriated American generals who saw it as another example of British overreach. Montgomery's counterattack from the north moved with characteristic caution, methodical and thorough but slow enough that the Germans were able to withdraw most of their forces before being trapped. After the battle, Montgomery held a press conference in which he suggested, with his usual tact, that British leadership had been essential to saving the Americans from their own failures. The American press erupted in fury. Eisenhower found himself managing yet another crisis in Allied relations, spending hours on the phone with Churchill and with his own subordinates, trying to smooth over damage that Montgomery seemed incapable of recognizing he had caused. Patton, hearing about the press conference, reportedly smiled for the first time in weeks. Montgomery had finally managed to offend everyone, not just the Americans he routinely dismissed, but the British politicians who understood that wars were won by coalitions and lost by arrogance. The final drive into Germany began in March 1945. Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on the night of March 22, using assault boats, and without the massive preliminary bombardment that Montgomery had insisted was necessary. Patton called Eisenhower the next morning to report the crossing, his voice filled with the satisfaction of a man who had just proven a point he had been making for months. Montgomery crossed the Rhine 2 days later after weeks of preparation, using every resource the Allied command could provide, including a massive airborne drop that Patton considered unnecessary theatrics. Both armies were now in the heart of Germany, racing east through collapsing resistance. The German army was dying, not from lack of courage but from lack of everything else. Units surrendered en masse. Cities fell without a fight. The end was visible, and both Patton and Montgomery could see it. But the prize they had competed for was no longer available. Eisenhower, acting on political directives from Washington and under pressure to avoid unnecessary casualties in a campaign that had already been decided, ordered the Western Allies to halt at the Elbe River. Berlin lay 90 miles beyond the Elbe, well within reach of Patton's tanks. Soviet forces were still fighting their way through the suburbs, paying in blood for every street. The Americans could have reached the city first. Patton pleaded for permission to continue, arguing that American lives already spent had earned the right to finish what they started. Eisenhower refused. The political agreement at Yalta held. Berlin would fall to the Soviets, and American and British forces would stop where they had been told to stop. Patton never forgave Eisenhower for that decision. He never forgave Montgomery for the fuel that had been diverted, for the opportunities that had been lost, for the lives that had been wasted in operations that served British pride more than Allied strategy. In his diary, in letters to his wife, in conversations with subordinates who could be trusted to keep secrets, Patton raged against the choices that had been made and the men who had made them. He believed, until the day he died in a traffic accident 6 months after Germany's surrender, that the war could have ended in 1944 if only he had been allowed to keep moving. He believed that Berlin should have been an American victory, not a Soviet one, and that the post-war division of Europe might have looked very different if different choices had been made in the autumn when the German army was broken and the road east was open. Montgomery, characteristically, drew different conclusions. He believed that Market Garden had failed not because the concept was flawed but because the execution had been undermined by insufficient support and by American reluctance to commit fully to a single decisive operation. He believed that his methodical approach had saved lives by avoiding the kind of reckless advances that left supply lines vulnerable and flanks exposed. He never publicly acknowledged any rivalry with Patton, dismissing the American general's complaints as the predictable whining of a man who had never understood the complexities of coalition warfare. In his memoirs, Montgomery barely mentioned Patton at all, an omission that spoke louder than any insult. The truth, as is often the case in war, was more complicated than either general wanted to admit. Patton's speed had been remarkable, his ability to exploit fleeting opportunities unmatched by any other Allied commander. But speed alone could not have ended the war in 1944. The logistical challenges of supplying fast-moving armored columns hundreds of miles from their bases were real, not invented by jealous rivals. The German army, even in retreat, retained the capacity to inflict horrific casualties on overextended attackers. And the political realities of coalition warfare meant that decisions about strategy could not be made on purely military grounds. Montgomery's caution had prevented disasters, but it had also prevented opportunities. His insistence on overwhelming force before any advance had saved British lives but had given the Germans time to prepare defenses that would ultimately cost more lives to overcome. Neither approach was entirely right or entirely wrong. Both generals were products of their experiences, shaped by previous wars and by national military cultures that valued different virtues. What remains indisputable is that the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery, personal and bitter and never entirely hidden from public view, had consequences that extended beyond hurt feelings and angry diary entries. Resources were allocated based on political considerations as much as military ones. Operations were approved or denied because of their impact on alliance politics rather than purely on their strategic merit. Soldiers died in battles that might have been unnecessary if different choices had been made, if fuel had gone to different armies, if egos had been smaller and vision clearer. The race to Berlin, the competition that neither general could entirely abandon even after it became obvious that Berlin was not the prize either of them would claim, consumed energy and attention that might have been better spent elsewhere. Berlin fell to the Soviet Army on May 2, 1945. After a battle that killed hundreds of thousands and reduced the city to rubble. American and British forces met Soviet troops at the Elbe, shook hands for the cameras, and withdrew to their designated occupation zones. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8. Patton attended the surrender ceremonies in Reims, standing in a room full of generals who had spent the war managing his ambitions and limiting his opportunities. Montgomery was there too, accepting congratulations for a victory that belonged to millions of soldiers, most of whom had never heard of either general, and would not have cared about their rivalry if they had. The war in Europe ended not with a dramatic race to a symbolic objective but with exhausted armies occupying whatever ground political agreements had assigned them. The rivalry that had defined so much of the final year of fighting simply stopped mattering. History moved on to other questions, to the occupation of Germany and the beginning of the Cold War, to trials and reconstructions and new conflicts that would make the arguments between Patton and Montgomery seem small and distant. But for those who had been there, who had watched the two generals circle each other like prizefighters waiting for an opening, the memory remained. It was a reminder that wars are fought by human beings, with all their flaws and ambitions and petty hatreds, and that even in the most existential struggles, ego and pride can shape outcomes as surely as strategy and courage. Patton died in December 1945, his neck broken in a car accident near Mannheim. Montgomery lived until 1976, long enough to see the Cold War harden the divisions that the Western Allies might have prevented if they had reached Berlin first. Whether either man ever wondered if things could have gone differently, if a different decision in September 1944 might have changed the shape of the post-war world, is something no diary or memoir can answer. What remains is the historical record, incomplete and contested, of two generals who hated each other, competed for glory, and discovered too late that the prize they sought had already been given away.